Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 46th installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Series. I'll be your host today. My name is Alex Condon. I'm the COO and co-founder of Galen Data. Today, we'll be hearing from Giovanni Lauricella of Lifeblood for a conversation on a range of topics, including venture funding, board construction, how to hire and retain talent, and what he's coined the MedTech Startup Equation. But first, a few housekeeping items, a little information on Galen Data. So Galen Data provides an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud offers a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that complies with FDA, HIPAA, CE mark standards. We're ISO 13485 certified, and the product on AWS is high trust certified as well. Founded by a team of seasoned medical device professionals, our goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost of building and operating, while shaving months of development off your timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay focused on their core mission without having to become IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics. As we go through the session, if you have any questions, you can type them in the Q&A section available on the sidebar, either to your left or right, depending on your browser. We'll either address those questions to Giovanni at the end, or if appropriate, I'll bring them up during our conversation. There are some handouts on the same control panel with some more information about Galen Data, a white paper on cloud connectivity, and some additional information on Lifeblood. Lastly, just as a reminder, a copy of this webinar will be sent to you via email in the coming days. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our guest, Giovanni Lauricella. Giovanni Lauricella is the CEO of Lifeblood. He has a bachelor's in finance and a master's in regulatory affairs and medical devices. He's traveled to 40 plus countries in support of MedTech, and he's assisted 500 plus startups with talent acquisition and fundraising strategies, leading to more than 2,000 hires, 300 million in raised capital, and 4 billion in acquisitions. Giovanni's an active board member, an angel investor, who brings 15 years of experience designing and building teams for MedTech, startups, and SMEs. Welcome, Giovanni. If you're willing, let's get a quick introduction to Lifeblood.
Thank you, Alex, for having me. And before I jump into that, I'm in my new office just a little north of you. So you're in South Houston, and now I'm officially in North Houston, right up in the Woodlands. And we love MedTech so much that this painting, if anyone can see it right behind me, was done by the co-founder of a transcatheter heart valve company called High Life over in Paris. And when we launched 2.5 years ago, he actually made it and sent it over from Paris. So this is a medical device artist, or I should say medical device co-founder turned artist from Paris, sent it over. And we just moved recently from South Florida over to Houston because we more than believe in what's happening in Houston in this amazing MedTech ecosystem, as well as the investor potential and also the current money that's around here. So huge reason why we moved here. And then this next one over here, as I brought it over, I'm still in the process of putting my new office together, but this is our team painting that we made last year. And there's an original one in Delray Beach where we're from that says, all you need is love and a whole lot of cash. And when we wanted to go buy it and put it in our office, it cost $10,000 for a painting. So we said, you know, we'll do one as a team effort, and we'll make it together, and we'll put our hands and our feet and our children's feet and our spouses' hands and feet, and we'll just do this whole team collective. And we change it up, and it says all you need is cash and a whole lot of love. So that's what you're seeing behind me. I just want to give some context to all those who are listening. But what is Lifeblood? It all started out with the fact that we've been building teams in medical device for upcoming on 15 years at this point. As Alex, you mentioned, my master's is in regulatory affairs for medical devices, which the reason why I wanted to get that is every step of the way within medical device, there's a regulation or regulatory component to it. And if you can understand regulatory, then you can at least at a high level understand what happens from soup to nuts and R&D through commercialization. So that's why I wanted to do that degree, and also help me dramatically be able to coach and help out startups and small to medium-sized enterprises in the MedTech field that are building their teams, everything from R&D through commercialization, and then the designing of their independent boards, and all the way down through their C-suite and entry level. So we build full teams, and because of that, startups typically need team and money, or people and capital. And a lot of the times the venture capitalists and the investment groups hire us for their portfolios to build out their portfolios from top down, of which, having done that year over year, we've amassed quite a sizable investor Rolodex, if you will. And that has allowed us to spin out an advisory group where we also help companies basically give them the confidence, the courage, and the ability to have a very sound story when they're pitching to their investors, in addition to us helping us open the doors for them. So we've helped facilitate a little bit more than 350 million at this point for right around 100 companies. And what do we do at this point? Build teams. And then on an advisory piece, we help a lot with the strategy and execution of capital raises and go-to-market strategies. And then lastly, which is really the fun piece of turning an ecosystem into a community, is we host events and we host sizable conferences. So I want to give a shout out to Dylan Attard, our big partner over in Malta, which I'm sure we'll be talking about at some point on this webinar. Every year we host a roughly 500-person entrepreneur and investor in MedTech conference on the island of Malta, which is, if you don't know where it is, it's the island right under Sicily, which is the island that's right under Italy. And gorgeous, gorgeous Mediterranean island that this year, November 6th through the 8th, we'll be having a CEO only and investor only events and days happening on the Wednesday. And then Thursday and Friday are the typical conference panel days, as you all know and have gone to. So we do that in Malta. Alex, once again, we'll throw it back to you. I know that you've been there. We'll talk about your experience there. And then also want to give a shout out to Marty Gomez from Goodwin, who's been a big partner and helped with us throwing events. He loves Houston, wants to throw down in Houston, and from coast to coast. And now actually we're planning already a conference in Paris for next year, has been really the foundational partner in enabling us to host either the MedTech Startup Equation panels, which we'll talk about, or CEO only conferences in their Goodwin offices, which has been amazing. So in addition to that, we do podcasts and make sure that we're getting some very pinpointed information and insight from both investors and entrepreneurs to share back with the community out there. So that's what we do: talent advisory and help build a community in the one and only industry that we mess around in, which is MedTech.
Yeah, some notes on that. So Giovanni actually joined us for our 19th webinar. Now we're on 46. And at the time, the investor list had eclipsed 1,000 investors. So I struggle to think what it might be today, 2 years removed. And also I need to take some design cues from you, because my backdrop is far less interesting. I've got this pull-up banner and an IT closet. All eyes on Giovanni. Don't look at the noise behind me. Fantastic. This is the first I've heard of the Paris engagement. And if anything, the Goodwin offices in Paris are very much a palace. So I'm sure that'll be a fantastic event.
We'll get to experience it, Alex. You'll be there.
Good. There you go. All right, sold. That was easy. Lifeblood. What do you consider the lifeblood of MedTech companies?
So it's not what I consider it. It's what 127 people consider it on the MedTech Money podcast that I hosted for 2 years. That was actually my opening question, which gave me the confidence and validation to then, when we started Lifeblood 2.5 years ago, after a 13-year career previous to that, ultimately gave the name to my company, Lifeblood. We started at Lifeblood Capital and then dropped the capital, and now we're just known as Lifeblood. But what is Lifeblood? Simplistically, for a company, it is people and money, or the order of necessity at the time, money and people more often than not. So that is the foundation, but then people can argue, of which we did, and we talked about this at a high volume on the podcast. Well, that could be for any company, which is absolutely true. You need money to obviously keep the doors open and keep people showing up every single day, but technology doesn't build itself, and you need the people to be able to implement that money to go out and build technology to then hit those milestones that then, yields those promises that the entrepreneurs ultimately told to the investors that gave them the money to begin with. So in addition to people and money, there was a lot of pushback, an addition, I should say, for what makes Lifeblood specific to MedTech. So beyond the foundational people and money, which you could argue is for any company, we live in a very regulated industry, but also an industry founded upon IP. So IP is very huge. And interestingly enough, especially in the startup world, whether it was investors or entrepreneurs, they considered passion a lifeblood aspect or component of a MedTech company, which I always thought was interesting, but also highly validated because, as you know, building companies from the ground up and being there from day one, if you don't care what you're doing, or you don't like what you're doing, or you don't have enough passion to sustain you through some of the downturns of building a business, especially in the early days, you're never going to make it. And so what I'd like to say is, specific to MedTech, it's people, money, IP, and passion.
Touching on that passion point, I think, with the kind of the funding drought of the last 18 months or so, I think that's one of the things that's kind of hardened a lot of MedTech founders is, so much of what they do is passion-based, right? Or, related to themselves, someone in their family, trying to solve a problem to help the greater good. And I think that, to your point, it would have been difficult for a lot of companies to sustain themselves over these last 18 months had that not been a key factor in their going forward. So.
And the sad part about that is there was plenty of people who had passion and ultimately had to close their doors based on how challenging it's been for the past 18 months. But I'm bouncing around a little bit here. At MedTech Malta this year, we'll be hosting again a panel called Serial Entrepreneur, and we touched base on this last year. Some of those hardships of having a great technology and, sadly enough, having to close the doors based on lack of funding. These people get up, close their companies on a Friday, and get back up and start a new one on a Monday. And that whole aspect of serial entrepreneurship and the commitment to developing technologies for patients, and also I think just in general, I mean, we're not in fintech, we're not in some of these other direct-to-consumer industries. Fundamentally, we're out there for the greater good. Yes, we're ultimately in an industry of business. Money flows left and right, up and down. People make a lot of money, people lose a lot of money, but we are foundationally built on technology that's supposed to help people. So another great thing about this is when you meet the people all around the world, service providers, industry partners, investors, entrepreneurs, there's an aspect of why they do this and what part they play in the greater community that you just don't find in other industries, and I love it.
That is a flawless segue to the very next question. So this is the MedTech Startup Equation. This is something that you've coined. It is a very unique style of panel, right? And it's very encompassing in the MedTech space. I'll leave you to introduce it. I've been a part of these, fortunately, thank you very much, a couple of times now, and hopefully more in the future. But could you kind of give the audience kind of what the MedTech Startup Equation is, kind of become emblematic of your brand? What is that?
Absolutely, thank you. And I have a new addition, which I'll talk on it too. So simplistically put, it's a panel that usually is two, and I think, well, I know in June 6th, when we did our most recent Houston event, we did 3 of each. It's usually 2 of each. This time we went with 9 panelists. We had 3 entrepreneurs, 3 investors, and 3 industry partners. And what does that mean? An entrepreneur is the one that's building the company day in and day out. They raise money from investors who either sit on their boards or hopefully have value to add besides a check, and they have their own perspective into what it goes into that company. And then if you stripped away and just left alone entrepreneurs and investors, could a MedTech startup only thrive and build itself on that? And the answer is no. If you didn't have industry partners, and I'm sure a lot of the entrepreneurs listening in right now might be rolling their eyes because they get tapped on the shoulder 500 times a day by solicitations of service providers trying to steal their lifeblood of money out of their bank accounts. But when we're needed, we're needed. And whether you're a CRO, whether you're a law firm, and you can't get around that, and you need them for IP protection and corporate counsel moving forward. Recruiters, when we are needed to run an educational process on why a hire's the right hire, why it's not the right hire, and so on and so forth. There's a whole ecosystem that's built into a community of very valuable service providers that are playing their part in helping out a startup build itself. So what I wanted to do was create a panel of all three different perspectives, where you have the day-to-day operator, we'll call them the CEO or COO or founders, which can speak to realistically a multitude of facets, or every facet of the company. What does it mean to hire the right partners and find them? What does it mean to hire and look for the right talent in those processes? What does it mean to raise capital? What does it mean to go through the engineering or the regulatory back steps of getting these companies through milestones? And then you have the investor profile. And realistically, what we try to tease out of that is, investors, when you're here, and not only what is it that you look for when you look for an investment, but when you write that check, what else do you do? Do you just write the check and just watch between the plexiglass and hope for the best? Or is there a criteria of value that you like to add? If so, and why? And then when do you join a board with a check? When do you not join a board with a check? So we get that investor perspective. And then lastly, it's the industry perspective, where you and I mean, I have this conversation regularly with the CEOs or the founders or the executive teams of the companies that we recruit for. They're recruiting for one company, and even if it's multiple positions, I get to see tens, hundreds of companies, 1,000 companies a year with multiple styles of each position globally. So you get this high data point, and you do the same in your own regard. So these service providers, whether they're lawyers, whether they're CROs, whether they're cloud connectivity providers, we have a very high volume, high touch point perspective that we can add as to what do we see wrong with companies, what is the high volume mistakes, et cetera. So that's another very valuable perspective. And so when you take a step back and you have two entrepreneurs, two investors, and two service providers sitting next to each other, riffing on the exact same style of, okay, what does it take to build a company? And then you see it from all three perspectives. When they start feeding off each other and, oh, I agree with you on this, but you might want to think about that, or you understand the contentions of the push and pull of an entrepreneur and an investor at the same table. So it's very interesting. I'll leave off with one point. The new addition that I'm going to be doing at MedTech Malta this year is adding the fourth perspective that I've been dying to do, which is entrepreneurs, investors, industry partners, and physicians who have a foot and a half involved in innovation. And so that's going to be a really interesting perspective as well.
Oh, no, I like it. I think that critical buy-in, right, on your path to market. You know, I'll add, we've talked about this in the past, this idea that MedTech takes a village, right? I was actually the panel that I was on in Malta last year. That was the title of the panel. And one thing that I would tell kind of entrepreneurs out there who are in the MedTech space is make sure that you try to join that community, right, as early as you can. I think that what that'll do, that cohesion, whatever ecosystem you're in, it helps kind of filter the wheat from the chaff, and the non-MedTech service provider, or I should say the generalist service provider that also does MedTech, might not be your best path forward. And definitely, you know, use your peers as a sounding board to find the service providers that might be the best fit for you and your product path kind of going forward. So something just to think about. I don't know if you have an opinion on that, Giovanni.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think playing off of, and you and I were together last night, and you know, we were talking about this concept of what is the nuance between an ecosystem and a community. And most people almost use them interchangeably because sometimes it sounds sexy to put them in your taglines or your articles that you're writing on LinkedIn about, oh, we're part of an ecosystem, we're part of a community, whatever it may be. If you really pay attention and you actually Google the differences of what is an ecosystem versus a community, and I'll leverage it for our conversation here in MedTech, biologically speaking, ecosystem is basically if you put a perimeter around a mass of space. There's living things, there's non-living things, there's air, there's things that coexist but don't necessarily play an integral part on one another. So a community is things that are having a magnet towards one another, that support one another, that have a relevance towards one another. A community exists in an ecosystem, or it could. An ecosystem doesn't necessarily constitute a community. So as we're part of a community that is out there helping one another, supporting one another, introducing good context to one another, especially as you and I do as service providers and industry partners and friends, that is part of a community where it's an identifiable support system that allows us to move forward together, where an ecosystem is just kind of like a stagnant blob. And I'd much rather be part of an ecosystem or a community rather than an ecosystem.
I would say scrap the Googling it. That was a much better definition of both terms. So just listen to that. Yeah, great delivery. So we've talked a little bit about kind of the the community aspect of things. One of the key things we talked about initially about Lifeblood is this idea of capital raising, right? So when you think of medtech as kind of a venture-backable industry, what kind of things come to mind? What things should founders be thinking of? Maybe inside the box, outside of the box. What are some things that you've kind of learned during this amassing of 1,000 plus funding partners?
I'm going to go on a riff, but if there's one concept just to walk away from when it comes to funding medtech, it has to be patient capital. I had a call this morning with a client, and I heard the term. We're today Tuesday, so already a few calls yesterday where there's companies that talk about their boards, which are constituting some of their investors who become board members. And they say, we've been at this for 5 years, we've been at this for 7 years, we've been at this for 12 years, and my investors want out. They just want out at this point. This concept of patient capital, and you have to understand that medical devices is a regulated industry that takes a lot of time, and there's this third party where if we're talking about direct-to-consumer devices that aren't regulated, it's about this creativity of a product that hopefully has a market, that really is about the tactical execution of commercialization, of scaling that once you get past manufacturing, to take this product or concept and then scale it out to the consumers without really much headway except for does the market want it or not. And there's a lot of commercial risk to that, not necessarily clinical or R&D risk for that matter. We face in medical device a lot of risks. We face R&D risk, we face clinical risk, we face commercial risk. And it's almost like this gating item or step gate all along the way. And so a big major thing that we face often in medical devices is this valley of death, which is oftentimes they've gotten past the R&D phase where they've amassed a certain amount of funding to get past towards, okay, I have a product that I want to now go clinically test. Maybe we've gone into design freeze. And now we have to go test it in 400 patients, 250 patients in this massive pivotal trial. Well, we've mitigated the R&D risk, so to speak, and now we're entering clinical risk. The investors who got in on the R&D phase took the really early stage risk. That now they have to ride out the timing of this clinical risk. But then when we get past it, then they have to go ride out the timing of the commercial risk if the company doesn't have a success and already get taken out. But there's this valley of death where these companies are going around asking for capital to fund clinical risk, which then it becomes almost binary. Like, do they get sent back 5 years of development when they realize it doesn't work in clinical? And do they shut down the company, or do they have to start the company all over again, meaning going back into clinicals? So there's a very long, risky path for medical devices. And if you're not well versed in this industry, which is why some of the most successful investors in our space come from this space. A lot of the time that when we talk about raising capital or raising good capital, a lot of the very good VCs in medical device, or a lot of the very good angel groups, or even family offices, dare I say, when you look underneath the hood, and you don't have to look that deep, they're often experienced medical device operators because they know what it takes. Going involved in taking a check that happens to be right in front of you. I have literally watched amazing technology having to fold its doors because $8 million fell out of the sky from, and I'm making this up, but not, $8 million fell out of the sky from a high net worth individual from Singapore who made their money in the casino industry, and they just really loved what you did. And they didn't want to be hands-on at all, but all of a sudden, when things started heating up and it really became a company, they had more of a say. But then all of a sudden, they don't really have the value add that they should, and then they want to get out, or they want to sell it to the first buyer, or whatever it may be, at the detriment of the actual evolution or the value base of the company. And it could crater the company. So all this to say is, patient capital is almost set it and forget it. With additionally adding value along the way is, when you investing in a medical device, if you're not really willing to chalk up to a 5 to 10 year run, you're in the wrong market. And then from a entrepreneur's perspective, when you're out there overly frustrated as to why you're not raising capital, you really have to stop and think about, are you looking for a philanthropic grant by someone just believing in you on how you want to go save the world and thousands of patients, full stop? Or are you really treating it as an investment? Because if you're really looking at it as an investment, you have to think about the fact that when someone holds $1 in their hand, they have the option to put it in real estate, cryptocurrency, high-tech software, which could be a unicorn for billions of dollars, which we very rarely see in MedTech, or put that dollar in your MedTech, and they're expecting a return. Your job is to create a narrative as well as an actual value proposition that's going to come to fruition in real life as to why their dollar going into your medical device is going to yield a return on investment greater and sooner, if that's possible, than putting it into crypto, the stock market, an S&P, ETF, real estate. You really have to ask yourself that question: is your value proposition as a technology that much better than that objective investor's options of putting that dollar elsewhere? If it's not, it's a philanthropic donation, and they shouldn't expect to get our ROI based on that dollar. They should just say that they're helping science.
I completely agree. I touched on your point earlier about kind of the different valleys of death. That clinical valley of death, right, is so, it's so pronounced these days because it's such a funding inflection point, right, for so many companies. And then post that, if you're not acquired, you have the commercialization valley of death. There's like 3 or 4 valley of deaths that a lot of those other kinds of industries, right, those B2C kind of industries just don't have to absorb, right? And to your point about investors and kind of investment appetite, I mean, it's not lost, that your money can be tied up for 10 years, right, in a medical device, right? This isn't like you talked about, crypto and investing in the stock market getting instant liquidity. This is a long-term commitment, right? And I think, also to your point, prioritize the smart money, prioritize the helpful money. Because it can take you far further, especially in such an industry with so many different facets to it, where you really need a lot of helpful humans around you.
Absolutely, and it's a real thing. I mean, early days when you're talking about angels, where they're not necessarily jumping on your board, or maybe they are. But then certainly in later days when it becomes institutional venture capital backed money, and those people are demanding a board seat, I mean, you really have to understand their value add, meaning the entrepreneur understanding the value add of that investor. Because if their motivations are not aligned with yours, if the vision of the company, you have to keep in mind, they are buying a piece of the company. They're getting equity in exchange for money to operate day-to-day business. And if you're understanding vision and mission of operating the company to that next milestone and just evolution of the company, is not aligned, and they're looking for a quick sell, or their fund timing, which is usually a 10-year horizon. I mean, think about that. A typical VC fund has a 10-year horizon with a mandate of investing in the first 3 to 4 years, typically speaking. Sometimes it's 2 to 3. If you're on the back half of that 10-year horizon, or you're one of the last investments, and you happen to be a class 3 implantable device that you're guaranteed a 10-year ride, if that investor gets on your board, you may feel pressure when you feel like you're all of a sudden having operational strides and adding significant value, and all that you need is one more massive round that's 2 years away to have this $300 million pop in valuation. But all of a sudden, that's not what that board member wants or that investor wants, because as much as they do want that big valuation, they're getting harped on by their LPs and their fund saying like it's time to cash out, and then they have to answer to them. And then all of a sudden that board becomes very dynamically negative, where then the board's not aligned, and then you start having operational struggles, and it becomes a house of cards if you don't take the right money.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, that idea of like a 10-year lockup, and I've seen even more. I've seen, funds that are especially in like pharma or those class 3 implantable devices, that the time horizon, if you're a participant, if you're an LP in those funds, you might not even live to see these devices come to fruition. So it's a different beast. Absolutely. And you mentioned board members. That might segue into kind of the next question here. Independent board members, right? And the importance of a well-constructed board. I know this is something that you do as part of your practice, finding those kind of game changer people. Could you touch about the importance of a board and what an entrepreneur should think about when they're piecing those things together? Go for it.
Early days, I don't think entrepreneurs pay enough attention to the significance of a board and also the value add that a board can bring. I'll speak generally. If you want to dig into anything, please do. But realistically, there's 3 major types that constitute a board of directors. It's typically the founders or an executive within the company, investors, and then independents. It's a good rule of thumb / practice that you would like or should have an odd number of board members in case there is that tiebreaker of a vote. So, I have seen boards of 4 and 6 and 2, and, it gets a little awkward when 2 think that way and 2 think this way. So it's little things like an odd number of board members, but then once again, aligned with the values of the company. When you get investors who are on your board, and once again, their mission or their incentives are not aligned with the founders, having a board that solely is constituted of founders or executives that run the day-to-day company in addition to investors, and that's where it stops, it could be a recipe for an oil and water disaster, which is really where independents come in. So for example, right now, I'll give a real world example. A month and a half ago, we were reached out by a fairly early stage company, and they reached out and they said, hey, listen, we want to do a CEO search. And I said, okay, well, let's talk about the company. The company's 4 years old. What they really need, they're a 510K device. What they really need to do out right now is go out and raise a $2 million bridge round, which will get them to 510K submission, of which then they want to go commercial. And so what they wanted to do was bring on a CEO who could really help them, because it's been hard the past 18 months, raise that $2 million, and then go out and commercialize this technology. Meanwhile, the real impetus for them pushing was the fact that they recently got a $130,000 grant. So I said, okay, let me just piece these puzzle pieces back together. You want to go out and hire a CEO who can raise you $2 million and then go commercialize the device. And you both as founders aren't taking salaries right now, but you want to go out and hire a market standard CEO and you have $130,000. Something's not aligning. And so fast forward through some consultative advice, they actually have been making amazing strides on the company on a fairly horseshoe budget to date. So kudos to them. $2 million is not venture capital backable money. That's not a $100 million fund that's going to invest $2 million or even take part of it. That is screaming out loud. It is high net worth individual, angel group, family office level money. So them spending even time reaching out to institutional venture capital for a $2 million raise was wasting their time. What we wanted to do was really help beef up their board, which is non-existent with the exception of the founders at this point, and help them prepare and build a relationship with a board member that's in preparation for taking on an investor at the board level. Where if we brought on the right person as an independent board member who has been there and done that, who has raised successful capital for medical device companies in the angel and family office space, maybe they have raised venture capital, but the point is that they have a Rolodex that they can open up doors if they get on this board and they align with the technology story, in addition to having that person have experience commercializing technology or taking it from R&D through commercialization. So the point is here is you're solving an executive challenge and a cash strap challenge by going out and exchanging equity in exchange for sweat equity from an experienced executive who doesn't have to resign from their current position or has done this multiple times over as a professional board member after a wonderful career in medical devices, And they're leveraging all that network and all that experience on your board, and they can help you out. And meanwhile, you're selling the story as the founders, which is what early stage investors really love to hear, is that grit and that passion. And then you're buying the next, we'll call it 2 years. You're going to raise that 2 million. You're going to have much more maturity in the company. You're going to get that 510K submission into the FDA. And then when you're out there raising a $6 million A round, and you need an experienced commercial facing CEO that you can now afford at market level, which is typically 300, realistically not, it's more like 350 to 450 plus a bonus. I mean, that is where you start getting, okay, let me go out and hire an actual CEO who can then lead this company to success in a commercialization strategy and then sell that investor or that VC story. So that's what we did. And so my whole point of telling you that is, a board is typically made up of founders, investors, and then it should have independence on there. An independent is exactly what it sounds like. It is an independent thought. It is an objective thought of bringing value to the company that doesn't have the same potentially harmful incentives as an investor would. And it could be more objective in a real world standpoint than the passionate founders have, and bring them back down to earth. And then have that mediating effect. And then the last piece of advice I'll toss on there is having your chairman of the board be the independent is a strong move, because then you have really objective governance of a board where you can have a sound executive lead a company, or at least give advice of a company, and then govern a board of founders and investors, and have a more active role in aligning the energy, if you will, on the board, rather than having it misaligned with potentially oil and water incentives.
No, that all makes sense. And, one thing to kind of talk about earlier, we mentioned this idea of community and this idea of kind of vetting service provider partners. If you're able to get a strong board member who's done it, right, who's had that exit, right, who brings their own community, their own village to the equation, it can save you so much headache in the search and so many potential foibles along the way, because you're going with trusted sources. One of the things that we talk about, coming from the software space, is this idea that, any service provider that you work with that might find a way of breaking your software, not creating it efficiently, or not creating it the way that you want, truly sets you back a tremendous amount in terms of time, in terms of in terms of cash, and it can be very detrimental. So I would say don't pinch pennies if you can just hit the accelerator, right? If you're in that lucky position to be able to afford top tier talent, it's top tier for a reason.
Just make sure they're also a team player too, because, and I'm not necessarily a sports guy. I'm trying to learn sports, but I do find the sports analogies to work, especially when it talks about team. You could have the best individual talent and players, but if they don't work and play with the team, you don't have a team, right? So you can recruit the best talent, but if they don't get along and they have a chip on their shoulder and no one wants to work with that person, well, those brilliant ideas don't manifest themselves by having an operational and executional team that gets it done. So there's a balance between cultural fit and the right talent for sure, and you obviously want to have the most optimal version of both of those combined, but talent for the sake of talent that doesn't play well in the sandbox with others is not talent.
Well, let's talk about that. Hiring talent in 2024, right? And retaining that talent. What would you give, in terms of advice to maybe that early stage company that's trying to piece together their team initially, or, maybe they're trying to scale? What's your take?
I think 2024 is a year of the start of a longer wave of correction in terms of building teams. It was a completely jostled situation when we went virtual for COVID out of necessity. And as a recruiter, where we thought the world was going to come to an end, and certainly the start of Q2 of 2020, where we went from building companies that had offices, and there was obviously some virtual work depending on the style of position, but it was still very much so the world that we've known for a while. There was headquarters, and there was offices, and there was relocations, and people still use Zoom and stuff, but it wasn't to the extent where people jump on video calls and think that you're weird now if you ask for a phone call. And so now we've gotten to a point where 2020 set in, and as soon as the world kind of picked up their feet and they're like, okay, well, this is not the apocalypse. We're going to obviously survive this, but we're going to do it from the comfort of our own homes and through screens. Companies that were adamant about relocations went virtual, and they were hiring people from all over the country. And then there was this whole cultural adaptation to, do we even need headquarters and brick and mortars anymore? We started seeing that utopia of virtual work collapse, at least the very holistic version of everything's going virtual, strongly starting in 2022. We've now lived it, I should say, especially on the back half of 22. We've now been in, 23, which was a tough year for fundraising, which bled itself into just a tougher year for expansionary purposes, but obviously companies did expand themselves. We are seeing a very holistic approach of companies coming back to in office. And I think where I come back to, and I'm sure there'll always be people who will disagree with me on this one, because there are fully functional virtual teams at this point, but there is a very strong concrete foundation of what we'll call the workforce today that is now revamping itself towards coming back to the office. And then, hybrid's going to be here for a while. I think the days of, forcing someone to check in and check out and they have to be there 5 days a week, I think that's going to either never come back, which is a strong word, or it's going to take a real long time for that culture to come back. But this whole in-office where you have to be present, and I think the realization of water cooler talk and the manifestation of ideas that wouldn't happen from your own home. I mean, and if we get just down to brass tacks, I push that in my company, in my firm. The ideas and some of the things that have happened on people being in a room together that were spontaneous, that weren't supposed to happen because small banter took place, have changed my company. I fully believe that. If we all realize that at the end of the day, humans want to find the easiest route, and we are fundamentally lazy, even those with the most amazing work ethics. If we have an amazing idea that, oh my God, I got to go call my boss, or oh my God, I got to call my peer and tell them that, oh, they didn't answer. Maybe it was the universe. They weren't supposed to answer to begin with. Well, that idea never will take root. That idea will never be shared. So I think we're in a correction where we're going to start seeing a lot more in-office work, and that's going to come back to how strong leadership is. I think this flabbiness of leadership has really taken place where it's been a perfect storm of a lot of reasons. First and foremost, there was a flattening of access to talent with LinkedIn and some of these other social media sources. And I think we were all adapting to the flattening of this, where all of a sudden now access to people is not the challenging part. It's how to weed through the white noise of finding the right people at the right time for the right motivations, where there is still a strong value to that. And then you have to find people who are willing to want to put in the work and see that sweat equity. So I think the retention period, we've been in a period of the power was held by the people, or the power was held by the workforce. And there's going to be a lot of people who are going to completely disagree with me, and maybe for the wrong reasons if you really dig deep. But there is a reason why there are fewer people who start companies and more people who work in companies. And entrepreneurship and leadership is not for everybody, and that is okay. It is more often than not a completely thankless job that is more of a servant leader than this dictatorial leader of, you do what I say because I have power over you. I think those days of, this lead by fear are out, and it really is, are you willing to be a servant for a multitude of people, and you happen to be a leader, but the intense pressure of being a leader and making sure that you're able to lead a project, lead a division, lead a company, set a vision, and then adhere the right resources to be able to execute on that. That's a skill set that most people don't want to take on, because leadership is extraordinarily hard. And it's too easy to push people away and say, oh, work from the comfort of your home, or, oh, you don't want to come in 5 days a week and you live right down the street. Well, why do you want Tuesdays and Thursdays from home? What is it that you don't want to work and drive? And then you're going to start seeing that manifest itself in companies. So, at the end of the day, there is a tremendous amount of competition for talent these days, especially with this flattening of access to talent. So leaders have to build good companies. I don't think beanbag chairs and the Google style approach of giving away free lunches all the time is the answer. I think that leads to a very entitled workforce, which I think we're actually reaping what we sow at this point in time, where there's a lot of people that the moment that things aren't going their way, they'll just jump back on LinkedIn and they'll jump to another company. And that is why, as a recruiter, it's very difficult to be in my shoes where you're selling talent. And then all of a sudden it's people's resumes where the longest they've ever been anywhere is 2 years. And more often than not, they have a very visible on their resume habit of leaving 9 months or 18 months, or maybe they've been somewhere longest for 4 years, but then it's been 4 2-year or 1-year jumps. And I think that's a cultural problem that we're dealing with, especially here in the United States, of a lot of entitlement and poor leadership. And I think that what we are going to be reckoning and going through a growing pain is finding and identifying and growing good leadership with teams that want to be together, that get back to the mission and the value of the actual business itself and want to be there versus, having a day by themselves and a day for self-discovery and things like that. And those things are necessary. But, building a company that has 401k and retirement, because we do live in the United States and we do have to adhere to that, or at least think about that do have healthcare benefits. Like, you can't skip across the board. But I think we're coming out of an employee culture-driven workforce and back to putting pressure on good leadership to build good companies that people want to work for, rather than being these self-made careers that manifest leaving every 18 months to 2 years and being unhappy at the end of the day.
Sure. No, I completely agree. My commute every day is an hour each way, right? Houston is very large. For those who aren't aware, it's a massive city. It's the 4th largest in the country. And my commute is pretty punishing. But, one of the things that even I notice is, for those times that I'm away, if I do try to work remote from someplace, you always notice slippage, right? And I think that this idea of kind of bringing everybody back in, especially if you're a startup company and you're wearing 7, 8 hats, right? It's going to become kind of more of an obvious necessity as these startup companies start running into friction, right? Because everyone is so adamant that they have to work remote. This is just my personal take, because I do think that, especially when you're early stage and stuff like this, that communication needs to happen like this to get things done. Before whatever the topic was flies out of your head because it got supplanted by something else, right? Some other problem, some other fire you have to put out. So completely, agree on that regard. And kind of harkening back to your core business in terms of recruitment, you talked about kind of LinkedIn and this idea of kind of prospecting. What is it, the alpha? What is the alpha that a recruiter can bring to that, let's just say, that startup equation, right? That can kind of propel people to success versus trying to go and try to find those kinds of hires, organically, right?
So, recruiters, what aren't we needed to be in terms of a value add? We aren't needed for our access to a network. And what do I mean by that? Most people think of like, okay, well, do you have a network that can do this position? I could tell you yes. I could tell you no, which then you'll go run from the hills, but you want to hear, yes, I have a network in that particular field. The reality of where a true recruiter brings, and yes, I am a focused recruiter in one industry, which adds tremendous value because I could speak the language of building that business, which if I went agnostic and went into the food industry and the longevity industry, I can't speak to the papers and to the technology that's being developed in there. I personally believe running a recruitment process of identifying talent and then running a communicative, high touch point process, that's a transferable skill set. But I think there's value add to having a recruiter that can understand the pain and also be consultative to understanding how to build that team and when and where is highly valuable. So what I'm trying to say is we're not hired for resumes. If you want access to a network, go pay whatever LinkedIn's charging. And if you want access to resumes, the only thing that I'd counsel you is take an hour to two and write some sexy story on why you need a director of regulatory. That's not just some copy and paste bullet thing that you find on Google, but create a company story and then go pay $1,500 for having that position up for a month, and then mine through the 400 applicants that you get and run your own process, and then you might find the person. That's the reality of doing it on your own. The value that a recruiter brings is process and the psychology of a third party, and ultimately being able to drive that high touch point process. So what do I mean by that? You're not going to hire me for resumes. We will have a very good ability to tell the story that we might get a little bit more of a signal above the white noise that we can attract people that maybe you can't, because we've been doing this for a long time. But if you put enough energy into it, I'm sure you can figure it out. The process that we run is this. First and foremost, hiring is extraordinarily time consuming. When a company hires us, we do a very thorough job of basically taking on their story, understanding at a high to mediumly complex level of being able to talk about the past, present, and future of what the company stands for, the technology, and also the competitive market landscape, and then also ultimately what we're looking for. We are out there as an extension of that company. So that's why we focus in the startup landscape. I mean, you know what it's like to build a company. You're wearing 8 hats. You're always wishing there was 30 hours in a day, not 24. And you literally don't have time to operate a company and hire multiple hires that constitute 400 people per position. We are an extension of you, so we're a time-saving effort there. That's one thing. The other thing is we run a process. So we're managing calendars. We're getting debriefs. I think that the next major point that I wanted to make is this psychological component. When you run a process, then there's a candidate out there that just happens to fall in love with your story. I'm a candidate and I want to join Galen Data. Well, everything is roses until we both lock in the fact that you want me and I want to join your company. And then all of a sudden it becomes a standoff between two people. I want to join Galen and you want to hire me, and there's no third party. So what does it mean? We went from falling in love with each other, soliciting each other, telling each other love stories, and now we admit that we both want each other. But now, me as the candidate, I want to join Galen for the best offer that I can get out of you. And you want me for the cheapest that you can get me. And there's going to be this tacit tug of war of you ultimately extending an offer to me that I may or may not accept because it's what you think you want me at. And then there's going to be this awkward negotiation phase. So we go from falling in love with each other to this very awkward negotiation phase. With a third party, and we're very thorough about this. So, in 2017, you guys can look this up. California and Massachusetts passed a law stating that an employer cannot directly ask a candidate what they're making financially. Well, what about third parties? What about building relationships with a third party, building a relationship and being that unique variable between a candidate who wants to join a company and representing that company and saying, hey, listen, what is it going to take? Where are you now? Building that trust factor of understanding where is that candidate? What are the actual financial as well as professional and then personal pain points that that person really needs to adhere to in order to make this move? Because the one big thing that most people don't want to credit recruiters for, especially ones that are very committed to the craft, big ticket items, selling of boats, selling of houses, selling of cars. Well, isn't it your career that gives you the paycheck to be able to afford all those things? So technically selling careers is the most challenging, biggest ticket item that you could possibly imagine. Well, isn't it a huge trust factor to then have a candidate trust their career decisions to a third party person who's then titled or entitled to broker that deal for them to make sure that they land at the company that they're ultimately happy at, who's going to pay them to be able to go pay their mortgage, send their kids to school or private schools, whatever it may be? It's a huge responsibility. So having that third party ability to be the psychologist and therapist for both, how do we land this person at a reasonable cost factor where a company who's just trying to whittle them down to as little as they can get them to the point where they might make that candidate squeak and they really do want to be part of your journey, but then all of a sudden 6 months into it, they realize that they joined at such a low salary that they're actually financially hurting and then they regret joining, and then all of a sudden a recruiter taps them on the shoulder and they leave you 7 months in or a year in, and then the employer is so regretful because it's so painful bringing somebody up to speed to have them leave them within a first year. Isn't there value to hiring the right person under the right circumstances in a very transparent model that makes the candidate happy, that makes the client happy, but then is running an educational process to yield? It's not just what's the best on paper. It's not just the cheapest. It's literally the right person at the right time with the right skill sets, and then fits the culture that's ultimately going to be there for a longevity of a run with the company that's going to add value.
I agree. It's very much kind of a marriage-like scenario, right? And you need buy-in and kind of happiness from both sides. You know, as we're wrapping up here, we only have a few minutes left. But one of the things that I definitely want to touch on is MedTech World Malta, because I love this event, and I'll be back again, like I mentioned, this year. Could you tell us a bit about, you know, what's going on in Malta? It's, you know, what's on the rock?
The funny part is we put together an amazing event last year, 500 entrepreneurs and investors, mainly from the United States. I think we had a head count of around 70% attendance from the United States come all the way over there. The rest was made up of Europe. If anyone, and I'm sure many people knew and knows what's going on in Israel and what has been going on in Israel, we had an amazing Israeli turnout that unfortunately we did not have presence there last year because MedTech Malta took place a week after the war broke out. But this year we're back and we're going to be highlighting Israel. They're an amazing ecosystem component to what's going on in MedTech. And so this is a conference that takes place on what we call the Rock in the Mediterranean. Most people who we even knew were coming last year had to say, oh, I had to look up where Malta was because I wasn't sure exactly where it was. And so it is off the coast of Tunisia, North Africa, and just south of Sicily, or Italy for that matter. And it is a very tiny country of about 500,000 people, literally in the middle of the Mediterranean. So on the furthest east end, you'll run into Israel. On the furthest west end, you'll run into Spain. And then right in the middle there, you'll find Malta. And most oftentimes, you can't even see it on most map representations. So that's where we are. Malta is an absolutely gorgeous country. It was a British colony up until 1979. So I call it a mixture of cultures thrown into a blender. So hear me out on this one. They drive on the left-hand side of the road. They use British outlets or UK outlets, electrical outlets. They use the euro. The Maltese language sounds like a mixture of Arabic and Italian if it was thrown in together. English is nearly flawless because of the fact that they were a British colony. So English is perfect. Catholic-based history, but yet right off the coast of North Africa. So amazing heritage, amazing castles, and an amazing opportunity to come together with entrepreneurs, investors, and very select industry partners to spend 3 days on an island that takes literally a half hour from end to end in an Uber, where, you know, after your panel's done or after you got what you needed from being in a 500-year-old hospital, which is our venue for the actual conference itself, you can grab an investor, you can grab a new friend that you made as a CEO or an entrepreneur and jump in and go to a castle for lunch, or go soak your feet in the Mediterranean in some rocky beach, or take a ferry over to the next island called Gozo, which is Malta is made up of both the island of Malta and Gozo, which is absolutely stunning. They make their own wine. I mean, it's just like this cultural immersion with phenomenal food that no one from this conference is from Malta. So when the conference is over at 5 o'clock and we roll into happy hour, it is literally forced 24-hour networking in a drop dead gorgeous Mediterranean setting.
I'll add to that. You know, one of the things that really kind of left an impression on me was, like you mentioned, 70% of the people are coming from the United States. It was very much kind of like a shared adventure, right? And, you know, I've kept in touch with a tremendous number of people that I went to Malta with relative to other conferences I've been to, where you're an ant and you're walking and you're going through the booths and you're going and sitting in a panel and you're not really talking to people. Here, there was this excitement, kind of like you mentioned, from kind of dawn to dusk, of people wanted to go out and explore together. And I think those shared experiences, you know, are kind of what makes this a wonderful community, right?
Yep.
You know, we're very much looking forward to the next go around come November. As you see below, some more random information about Galen, but also more importantly, ways of reaching out to Giovanni. So please, anyone who's in attendance that might be looking for that kind of game changer recruit, please feel free to reach out. Contact information is there. Lifeblood does all kinds of things, and I'm sure as soon as you kind of dive into the website, you will get a taste of all the different irons in the fire that Giovanni has. And sincerely, thank you very much for kind of creating this community around MedTech. Right, you're one of the most kind of well-connected people in the space, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you so much for having me, Alex. What I do want to add value to this webinar as well as all who are listening in and who are listening in live right now. We want to offer complimentary registrations to anyone who's on this webinar right now to come to Malta and join us. Of course, unless you're an enemy of the state, you don't get a complimentary registration. But if you're not an enemy of the state and you are a community-driven medical device industry partner, investor, entrepreneur, and you want to see what MedTech Malta is all about, please reach out to me. More than glad to offer you a complimentary registration and check out what The Rock has to offer.
Oh, that's very generous. And on that note, everybody have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next month. Thank you, Giovanni. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me.